As far as I know, and there could be others, but I've not become aware of any. As far as I know, we are the only evangelical church in New Brunswick to observe Earth Day. And it's something that we've been doing since 2012. This is our 6th annual Earth Day service, and it started with a challenge that I was given by a young woman in the congregation. Her name at that time was Abby McGilvery. And she challenged us as a congregation to take more seriously our environmental stewardship. And she issued a number of challenges to us, and one of which was to recognize Earth Day. She said, "Why do we as a congregation not recognize Earth Day?" And I had no answer for her, because when you think about it, Christians of all people should be concerned about the earth. We're the ones who recognize that God created the earth, that He has made us stewards of the earth, and He calls us to take care of the earth. And that's why we recognize and celebrate and observe Earth Day. In fact, as we're going to see in our series on Revelation, which we're getting back to next week, care for the earth is a part of the message of that book. In fact, there's a very somber passage in Revelation where we're told that the day is coming when God will destroy those who destroy the earth. And so we have a very serious responsibility that God has given to us, and it should be, for evangelical Christians, it should be a part of the message that we preach, but too often it's ignored. And so today we're talking about Earth Day, and I'm preaching a message that I've entitled The Secret. And you're not going to see right off the connection between what I'm preaching and Earth Day, but I'm hoping that by the end of the message you will. Everybody wants to know the secret. Everybody wants to know the secret to true and lasting joy. How can I get joy in my life? How can I hold on to it? Well, the scriptures contain the secret to joy, and Paul talks about the secret in his letter to the Philippians. And Paul tells the Philippians that if they want joy in their lives, then there are 3 qualities that we need to grow and develop in our lives. And if you're following along in your outline, you can jot down these 3 qualities. The first one, if you want to have true and lasting joy in your life, the first quality that you need is faith. Faith. Paul talks about this in the scripture that we're going to be focusing on this morning, Philippians chapter 4. It'll be up on the screen, and I'm very grateful to Scott and his team today, because Rob Melanson is ill, and he usually handles the PowerPoint, and so they're pulling double duty today, so I'm appreciative for that. Philippians chapter 4, beginning at verse 4. Paul talks about faith. Look at what he says. "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious," hear this, "do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." What's Paul talking about there? He's talking about faith. Now, Doug Horseman reminded me last week, another word for faith is trust. We're to show trust in God and live a life of trust. Rejoice in the Lord always. How do we do that? And then even harder in verse 6, don't be anxious about anything. Don't worry about anything. But make your requests known to God with thanksgiving. He's talking about living a life of faith, a life of trust, a life of confidence in God, knowing that we're safe in His hands. And some of you say, well, it's easy for Paul to say that. He was a great missionary. He was a great Christian. He probably had a lot of people following him, a lot of people encouraging him. He wouldn't have had too many difficulties. Au contraire. Paul talks about his life in 2 Corinthians. If you want to flip back there, you can. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning at verse 3. Paul's talking to the Corinthians about his life, and listen to what he says. He says, I've worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. Now in Jewish thought, if you wanted to kill someone, you lashed them 40 times. If you wanted to bring them to the brink of death but not kill them, you lashed them 39 times. I don't know how exact their science was. But so if a judge imposed on you 40 lashes minus 1, it meant to the brink of death without going over. And Paul says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in dangers from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled, and I have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn? What a life. What a struggle his life must have been. How hard it must have been. And he didn't have the perspective of looking back from 2,000 years and seeing what an impact he made. We're looking at Paul's letter to Timothy in our Wednesday night prayer meeting. And the last letter that he ever wrote that we have record of is 2 Timothy. And in this last letter, Paul, an old man, he says, everyone has deserted me. And yet he could also say, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Do not be anxious about anything. But with prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. That's faith. That's faith. The story is told of a farmer who had a donkey. And his poor little donkey fell into a well. And the farmer did everything he could to get that donkey out of the well, but nothing that he tried worked. So finally he thought to himself, you know what? It's an old donkey anyways, and I've been wanting to stop up this well. Neither one of them's good for anything. So he called some neighbors over. They brought shovels, and they thought they were going to get rid of the donkey and get rid of the well at the same time. So they took the first shovelful, and they threw it into the well and landed on top of the donkey. And the donkey was not a stupid donkey. And he very quickly realized what was happening. And he started braying and started panicking and realized that he was being buried alive. But after a few moments, he calmed down. And when the dirt landed on his back, he shook it off and he stepped on top of it. And then when the next pile was thrown on him, he shook it off, and he stepped on top of that. And over time, the farmer and his friends realized that an amazing thing was happening. The donkey was rising up further and further and further. And finally, after a while, after so much shaking and stepping, he finally was able to step out of the well. When I said that story in the first service, Yvette asked, well, did the donkey kick them when he got out? But what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is this: life is going to shovel a lot of dirt on you. And you have a choice. You can let life and the dirt that it throws on you bury you alive, or you can keep shaking it off and taking a step up. When you shake it off and when you take a step up, that's faith. That's trust. That is hope in God. You see, each of our troubles can bury us, or it can be a stepping stone. And Paul used all the things that happened to him, the lashes, the shipwrecks, the hunger, the thirst, the storms, the danger. He used them as stepping stones to increase his faith and his trust in God. And that's why he could say, do not be anxious about anything, but rejoice in the Lord always. And then Paul goes on. So he's talked about faith, and then beginning in verse 8 of Philippians 4, he goes on. And this is one of my favorite passages in the entire New Testament. I love these words. Paul says, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. What's Paul talking about there? What I love about those words is the simplicity of it. Whatever is true, whatever is pure, whatever is right, whatever is good, whatever is praiseworthy, think about such things. He's talking about living a simple life. And I'll tell you, it's something that I need to be reminded of every day. I remember when I was starting out in my life and didn't have a lot of money. And my dad would remind me, he said, Richard, all through your life, you need to separate what you need from what you want. And he said, you'll get in trouble financially if you think that your wants are needs. If you keep them separate, you'll be okay. And I found that his words have been so true over the years. And I suspect that, I know I could, and I suspect many of you, if you went home today and looked around your house, within 15 minutes, you could find a dozen things that you're not using anymore. And we have a wonderful opportunity, by the way. If you were to do that, I'm just thinking about this now. We have these 3 families coming into our church from the Philippines, from Russia, from Guatemala. Go through your house. Make it a blessing to yourself by simplifying your life, and make it a blessing to others by giving them a start in their new life in Canada. What an opportunity for us. You know, I was challenged by something I came across today. It was an article on whether I own my possessions or my possessions own me. And it was a series of questions. Look at these questions. You may want to jot some of these down. Answer these questions. Number 1, do I tend to buy on impulse or after thought and prayer? I don't want any husbands looking at their wives while we're doing this. Do I tend to buy on impulse or after much thought and prayer? Number 2, do I give the Lord my first fruits or what is left over In other words, when you get paid, you get your money in, do you take what is for the Lord and take it off the top? Or do you wait and see if there's anything left at the end of the month? And then if there's some left, maybe give him some. The Lord says that we are to give of our first fruits to him, not what's left over. Number 3. Oh boy. Do I get upset when something I have is lost or destroyed? Do I get very upset when something I have is lost or destroyed? Number 4, do I need to buy things to be happy? Number 5, do my material possessions hinder my testimony for Christ? If someone were to look at how you spend your money, would they say, here is a person that has his priorities straight, who is honoring the Lord? Or would they say something else? Do my possessions hinder my testimony for Christ? And the final question, number 6, do the things I want make it easier or harder to serve the Lord? Do the things I want make it easier or harder to serve the Lord? It's a matter of looking at our lives, and Christians, evangelical Christians, are beginning to come around to how closely connected our lifestyle is to our faith. And they're discovering new freedom in simplifying our lives. And in our church, as I said, we can do a double blessing and bless ourselves through simplifying and bless some families that are coming to Moncton. So Paul in verses 8 and 9 talks about simplicity. He's talked about faith. He's talked about simplicity. And then the third and final one is, if you want to live a life of lasting joy, we need to learn contentment. Contentment. Look at what Paul says. I love this passage, beginning at verse 10. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned, listen to this, to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Now notice he says, I have learned the secret. That's why I entitled this message, The Secret. I have learned the secret to contentment. And then he says in verse 13 what the secret is. I can do everything through him, through Christ, who gives me strength. No matter what his condition was, no matter what his situation was, and remember he talked about it in 2 Corinthians, he was content because he could meet every challenge through Jesus Christ. I want you to picture a scene in your head. It's the middle of July, and it's a really hot day here in the church. And the fans are going, and it's hot, and it's cooling it down a little bit, but not very much. And you've got, sweat coming down your cheeks, and your clothes are sticking to your back. It won't be long before we experience that situation. But in the midst of it all, you're hearing an absolutely outstanding sermon. Anything you want to say, Russell? I came to this point in the message in the bridge, and Russell called out, who was preaching? So it's the summer, so there's a guest preacher here. And you're hearing an absolutely wonderful message in spite of the heat. And he's talking about the salvation we have in Jesus Christ and the life that we have in him and the sacrifice that he made for us. And he's bringing it alive, and he's almost making you forget where you are. But then, because it's so warm, the church street door is open. And right off in the distance, you hear a sound. And it's a sound that brings you back to your childhood. It's a bell ringing. And it's a sound that you'll know no matter how old you get. It's that unforgettable sound of an ice cream truck. Yes, Joy and John got it. And as soon as you hear that bell, you start thinking about ice cream. And then you realize how hot it is in church and how wet and sticky your clothes are and how the perspiration's coming down your cheek. And the pastor, the minister, he's droning on. And that contentment that you are feeling just a few moments ago is completely gone. Hear me on this. In your life, there are all kinds of ice cream trucks. There are all kinds of things waiting to destroy your contentment and your peace. And Paul says that he has learned the secret of ignoring those bells, ignoring those trucks. And we do it by nurturing in our lives a life of faith, a life of simplicity, and a life of contentment. You've heard the quote from the man who said, "I was so angry because I had no shoes until I met a man who had no legs." And that's the way many of us are. So I want to encourage you to nurture these qualities in your life. Some of you may be saying, well, that sounds fine, but what does it have to do with Earth Day? It has everything to do with Earth Day. You see, we have a mandate that's been given to us by the Lord to be stewards of this earth. We saw this in January, didn't we? We're not owners of this planet. We're stewards. And we're called to look after it, to take care of it. And there's two ways to do that. One is what I call the temptation method. It's the way that many of us deal with temptation. We just try to resist it with willpower. You know how that works. We do that with the earth sometimes. We say, well, I'm just going to be better about recycling and reusing. And what's the third one? Reuse, recycle, and reduce. Yes, I'm going to be better at those 3 R's. And we try and do it with willpower. And like temptation, it lasts for a little period of time. But we can't keep it up for long. But if we nurture these qualities in our lives through the depth of our relationship with Jesus Christ, and we're living a life of faith, a life of simplicity, and a life of contentment, I guarantee you, you will not be abusing the earth. You will be taking care of the resources that God has given to us. Those of you who are regular attenders here will be familiar with our Ignite program. I don't have time to go through it from start to finish, but let me just say it is a self-directed spiritual growth program that we have developed out of this church. And if you see it in other churches, which you might, they've borrowed it from us. But we've developed it here. It's an opportunity for you to take responsibility for your spiritual growth and your relationship with Jesus Christ. And when you do that, one of the areas that you can focus on is simplicity. And we have resources on our website to help you with that. Our website is firstmoncton.com. There is an Ignite tab, and underneath the Ignite tab, or inside the Ignite tab, there are resources on all of the disciplines that we mentioned there. One of them is simplicity. And if that's one that you want to focus on, perhaps going into the summer, I encourage you to go on to firstmoncton.com and look at the resources that are available there. If you don't have internet access, give the church office a call. Say that you want the Ignite resources on simplicity or anything else, and we'll make them available to you. But this is an opportunity for us as individuals and as a congregation, not only to deepen our relationship with God, but to be stewards of this planet that He's given to us. And next week, we get back into Revelation.